Uh, Thank you all for being here. It's a particular pleasure tonight to have Wayne Wiegand here because he is, as I will explain in my introduction, the Dean of Library Studies, of Library History. He's an icon in our world, kind of a, well, he's a legend, really. And I will explain that. I will explain all that in a minute. But I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs. And so tomorrow, what's tonight? Tuesday? Okay, so Thursday. Thank you. Yeah, you know, it's been a long week and it's only Tuesday. So on Thursday night, we have a program with the Truman Library, the Presidential Library. A great friend of mine, wonderful lecturer, wonderful writer, former professor at the University of Missouri, who now teaches at Emory, Carol Anderson, will be talking about her topic. It's a World War II topic. We Fight: Red Tails, Black Soldiers, and the Civil Rights Movement. And Carol's written one of the basic books about the effect of World War II and of course, the important role that so many African-American soldiers, sailors, and airmen played in the war, and how the effect that had on the Civil Rights Movement, the creation of the Civil Rights Movement. And Carol is one of the world's leading experts on that, and she's a good friend of mine, and she's just a wonderful person. So anyway, that's Thursday night at the Plaza Library, and love to have you there for that. And then another friend of mine, these are, it's Friends Week at the library. Wayne is a friend, I think, too, but he'll tell you whether or not he thinks that. It is next week on Tuesday here at the Central Library. We've got Bob Lighton. And Bob, some of you will know, was the Vice President of Research, basically the #2 guy at the Kauffman Foundation for a long time. A member of the Chief of Staff of the Council on Economic Advisors under President Clinton. And during the late unpleasantness, the Great Recession, he was a frequent commentator on NPR, the only one who made sense, in my view. Bob is going to be here with his really interesting book, $1 Trillion Economists: How Economists and Their Ideas Have Transformed Business, really transformed the world. It's about the ideas of important economists over the last 3 or 4 decades, and how that's led to changes in the world of business, the world of regulation and government, and the actual ultimate effects on our lives. And Bob is one genuinely smart dude, let me tell you. So I highly recommend that. And I'll be here at the Central Library next Tuesday, the 29th. And then next month, and I'm sorry I don't have October's calendar, I've already received some attention, maybe even criticism, for our headliner, our cover of the October calendar. On October 5th, we have the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration and guru, talking head on TV, very important and articulate left-wing economist, Robert Reich, who will be here on October 5th. And this dovetails into something that I'm going to talk about with Wayne, which is we have 2 filmmakers who are coming with him. They're traveling with him to, he's written a book called Saving Capitalism, in which he purports to offer remedies for our economic ills that people of both the left and the right will find intriguing and come together around. And so the filmmakers are following him to see if that's actually the case. So any of those of you who are on the right who want to test this theory should come on October 5th to hear him, because they will want to interview you afterwards and see if you've been convinced. If you're on the left and already convinced, they probably won't interview you, but they would be happy to have you cheering lustily in the crowd. So anyway, so we might be featured in this documentary about Robert Reich, which will lead me into my introduction of Wayne, because Wayne has been working with some filmmakers. Well, let me start at the top about Wayne and say, about 10 years ago, I think it's about 10 years ago, Wayne came to the Kansas City Public Library when I was a wet behind the ears puppy of a librarian. I think our true professional librarians still would have a hard time using the word librarian about me, non-professional librarian. But Wayne came with some ideas about studying the way people our patrons use the library and the effect of the use of the library on them. And he had this great phrase, which he used with us 10 years ago. I heard this phrase 10 years ago, and it's a really important phrase in this great book, Part of Our Lives, The History of the American Public Library. And it is this. We all, in the library world, we're all concerned about the life of the user in the library, the patron of the library, you all in the library, what we're doing for you in the library, what you're doing with us in the library. But what Wayne wanted to know was, and this is a phrase he got from a professor of his, I'm sure he'll mention this in his talk, is about the library in the life of the user, about the library in the life of the patron, the library in the life of the community. What is our effect? You know, libraries, like many professional organizations, many institutions in American life, for a long time we were about inputs. Library was defined by how many books we had. And then we were about outputs. What was our circulation? How many books did we get out of our stacks and into your hands? Outputs, both good measurements, both important things. But today it's really about, and Wayne is one of the leaders in the study of this and in the encouragement of this, it's much more about the outcomes. It's about what that book in your hands will do, that computer that you use in the library will do, that activity, our organized knowledge around health and wellness, around economic development, how we help you find a job, how we bring people together around various community activities, how that affects your life, and ultimately how it affects the life of the community. We were talking a little bit in our library board meeting. I thought of it as a Wiegand moment. Today, we were talking about our strategic planning, and I had our youth and family engagement. We used to call them children's services. Before that, they were children's librarians, et cetera. We changed the names about every decade to prove that we're still awake and alive. But we were doing their strategic plan. We had a presentation from a great young librarian about that. And the key word there was empowerment. How are we empowering children or teens to enter their worlds in the community? And I thought that's a great word, and it's something that this book, Wayne's book, is all about, which is how libraries transform the lives of our patrons, so that the patrons can go out and participate in the world. It's about citizenship, about understanding how the government works. It's about health and wellness, so you can in this incredibly complex world of healthcare that we're involved in, you can navigate your way to find the best things for your own health, your own nutrition. It's about finding a job. It's about developing a career. It's about developing skills that help you in your life and your career and all the things I've just mentioned. And most importantly, it is about developing you as a citizen and a human being, and in all aspects, empowering you to be the best you that you can be. And that's what libraries have always been about, not just going back to Benjamin Franklin's time, and he talks a lot about Franklin in the book, and useful knowledge, and getting all the boys together to talk about how we can develop the economy and develop useful things in Philadelphia or Boston. But it goes all the way back, I think, to the library in Alexandria and others. And it's about how we can use knowledge to make our lives better. And that's what Wayne's book is about, and what his career has been about. He studied at the University of Wisconsin and taught there at the University of Wisconsin. He's been a visiting professor, the Kennan visiting professor at the University of North Carolina. He's done things like organize the Florida Book Awards. He's had a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He has really become, over time, he's written the biography, Irrepressible Reformer of Melville Dewey, who, of course, you all know is more important in the library world than almost anybody because it's the Dewey Decimal System. And Main Street Public Library, Community Places and Reading Spaces in the Rural Heartland, one of his books. And now, Part of Our Lives, The History of the American Public Library. He is the Dean of American Library Historians and Students. He's been working with two filmmakers who are about to make the first documentary ever made on public libraries. It's hard to believe that we haven't had one. I'm sure you'll see it on PBS. We've spent some time talking to Wayne and talking to these filmmakers. I think they will make the Kansas City Public Library one of the featured libraries in their documentary. It's called Free for All. Thank you. And Wayne is their primary advisor, as he is my advisor on everything to do with how to make a great library. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dean of American Library Studies, Wayne Wiegand.
Can you play that legend thing back for my kids? I don't think they've ever heard that word attached to me. Well, thank you very much for being here. I always enjoy coming back to the Kansas City Public Library for obvious reasons, but something, Crosby, I think you took my talk with you as you left the podium. Yeah, I think so. Where are you? I don't quite have it memorized.
It's the first time, honestly, the first time.
Was there something conspiratorial in that? I'm a retired person, so I sit at home a lot and don't talk much. And I'm now on a 28-city book tour with Part of Our Lives. And my voice is starting to get a little raspy, so forgive me. That's why these 3 bottles of water are up here. I have a huge goal here today, to persuade you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. I'm motivated in large part because of conclusions that emerged from research on this book I've recently published, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library. My goal in that book was to find out historically why people love these ubiquitous institutions. And love them they do. A 2013 report by the Pew Research Center's Internet and American Life Project noted that in the previous decade, every other major institution, government, churches, banks, corporations, has fallen in public esteem except libraries, the military, and first responders. The study also found that 91% of those surveyed over 16 years old said libraries are very or somewhat important to their communities, and 98% identified their public library experiences as very or mostly positive. Another Pew study found 94% of parents believe libraries are important for their children. 84% said because libraries develop a love of reading and books. In my historical narrative, I didn't take the conventional user in the life of the library approach. Rather, I took a library in the life of the user perspective, which was suggested to me by my colleague Doug Schweitzig at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, because I wanted to trace the history of the public library not so much by analyzing the words of its founders and managers, but mostly by listening to the voices of people who used them since the middle of the 19th century. Thus, instead of a top-down view, Part of Our Lives adopts a bottom-up perspective that features the voices of generations of public library users. Largely because of recent technologies, uncovering many of these voices was not difficult. Time-consuming, yes, but not difficult. Some are published in memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies of the famous, some in manuscript collections in public library archives across the country. The vast majority, however, are fixed in thousands of U.S. newspapers and periodicals digitized since the 1990s into huge databases. By using public library as a search term, I found thousands of voices in letters to the editor, thousands more quoted in stories reporters wrote about their local libraries. As I analyzed this data, I was surprised at how quickly it organized into 3 main categories. In no particular order, people have loved their public libraries. 1, for the useful information they made accessible. 2, for the public spaces they provided. And 3, for the transformative potential of commonplace stories they circulated that helped users make sense of their world. First, a few historical examples that comfortably fit the category of information as we currently define it in librarianship. While sitting at a Cincinnati public library desk in 1867, Thomas Edison compiled a bibliography on electricity. A colleague later recalled, many times Edison would get excused from duty under pretense of being too sick to work, and invariably strike a beeline for the library, where he'd spend the entire day and evening reading such works on electricity as were to be had. In 1899, Wilbur and Orville Wright came upon an ornithology book at the Dayton Public Library that rekindled their interest in human flight, one of their biographers writes. By the time I was 12 or 14, Harry Truman recalled, I had read every book in the public library, including the encyclopedias. These books had a great influence on me. In a Detroit Public Library reading room in the 1950s, a teenage female pored over comedians' printed monologues. She appeared in short monodramas written by herself without makeup and hardly any props, Lily Tomlin's biographer later noted, conjuring up not only the personality of the characters she portrayed, but also that of unseen people with whom she was talking. About the same time in Hot Springs, Arkansas, 10-year-old William Jefferson Clinton discovered the Garland County Public Library. I'd go there for hours browsing among the books, especially those on Native Americans, which may explain that shirt. In 1971, 10-year-old Barack Obama returned to Honolulu from Jakarta. First place I wanted to be was in a library, he later recalled. Often he had a specific information need. One Saturday, with the help of a raspy-voiced old librarian who appreciated my seriousness, I found a book on East Africa. Obama wanted information about Kenya, birthplace of his father, a Luo tribe member. The Luo raised cattle and lived in mud huts and ate cornmeal and yams and something called millet, the book said. Their traditional costume was a leather thong across the crotch. Shocked by what he read, Obama left the book open-faced on a table and walked out without thanking the librarian. All these people had information needs an American Public Library met, and the anecdotes I've read nicely fit the traditional discourse of librarianship that focuses primarily on information. In many respects, the professional discourse functions like a big intellectual sandbox, plenty of room to play with ideas, but one nonetheless with limits, a social boundary, if you will, in which the profession's leaders employ a formal way of thinking to educate and enlighten members who then implement what they learn to improve professional service for the public's greater benefit. For librarians, that generally translates into services they institute and maintain, and collections, spaces, and resources they make accessible. For most of its history, librarianship's discourse is focused on what in the 18th century was called useful knowledge. In the 19th and 20th was called best reading, which is still part of the phrase of the official motto of the American Library Association, and in the late 20th has morphed into information. This focused term gives particular meaning to the phrase access to information that to this day dominates the profession's thinking and automatically imposes boundaries on its intellectual sandbox. But the American Public Library is a unique civic institution because, unlike most other civic institutions like courts and schools, people don't have to use it. As a result, over the generations, users heavily influence the process of shaping library collections and services. Librarianship's discourse, however, does not address in any direct way this kind of bottom-up pressure, and for me was not comprehensive enough to explain what I was discovering about library as place and the transformative power of stories users withdrew from libraries over the generations. So to explain my findings, my challenge became how to expand beyond the professional discourse, how to see outside the boundaries of librarianship's limited sandbox of ideas, how to craft a framework that accommodated and explained the voices of library users I was uncovering in my research. To illustrate the importance of library as place, let me introduce you to Ricky. I gotta see if there we go, okay.
My name is Ricky Powers. I live in San Francisco and I've been here for about a decade, and I'm currently unemployed, but I do go to school. My apartment is about this big, and I don't have any room for a desk, and so I come to the library to do my homework, but it's also just a great resource. I like to come to the gallery and see what shows they have going on. I come to lectures, I come and see films that they do. Mayoral debates, I've been here for a couple of those as well. Well, the reason that I'm here is because I think it's just important for people to understand. So when I first moved to San Francisco, I told you I went broke, and I was literally starving. And I had a place to live, but the library kept me warm, and it did. I'll get it together here in a second. There was a truck that came outside once a week, and I could go and get food there. And then, like I said, they have computers so that I could work on my resume and I could apply for jobs. And did I mention that it was warm here? So it's been there for me when I needed it. And it's a valuable resource. And oftentimes I think that people see the library as someplace for kids or someplace for homeless people. And there are just normal people like me that might need it as a resource, and I'm grateful that it's here.
That was one of 3 trailers I have for you this evening that was drawn from that documentary on the American Public Library that's being prepared. And it's kind of that angle of vision that they're taking. Free for All is their title, inside the public library. Now, from my narrative, I quote a few more anecdotes. During the summer of 1939 at the Atlanta Public Library's African American branch, one of the few places in the city where blacks felt safe and welcome, 10-year-old Martin Luther King came to the library many times during the week, Director Annie Waters later recalled. He'd walk up to the desk and look me straight in the eye. "Hello, Martin Luther," she'd respond, always calling him by his first and middle names. "What's on your mind?" "Oh, nothing particularly." For Waters, that was a cue that King had learned a new big word, and they then initiated a conversation in which King used the word repeatedly. Another game involved poetry. Again, King would stand by the desk, waiting. "What's on your mind, Martin Luther?" Waters would ask. "For I dipped into the future, far as the human eye could see," he responded. Waters immediately recognized the poem and finished the verse, "Saw a vision of the world and all the wonder that would be." When the Cincinnati Public Library opened a piano room in 1955, among its first visitors was a 12-year-old Jimmy Levine, as he wrote his name in pencil on the room's sign-up sheet. 8 visits later, he changed his signature to J. Levine and finally James Levine. When he gave a concert for 150 children in the children's room in 1957, he'd already performed as a Cincinnati Symphony soloist. Today, he's the New York Mets artistic director. I can see some of you saying, "Oh yeah, that's who it is." In 1969, In 1969, the Gary, Indiana Public Library sponsored a local talent contest at which a group soon to be known as the Jackson 5 competed. Although they didn't win, Little Michael was an audience favorite. In 2005, the Washington Post carried an article by Eric Wee that focused on the District of Columbia branch library in one of Washington's poorest neighborhoods. In it, we reported that every Tuesday night, a homeless man named Conrad Cheek entered the library and set up his chessboard on one of the tables in the children's room. We immediately noticed the transformation taking place. No more ignored pleas for this homeless man, no averted glances. During the next hour, people will look him in the eye. They'll listen to his words. In this Down at the Heels library, he's the teacher. Among his students was 9-year-old Allie Osman. As we watched this interaction, Allie's mother explained that her son's confidence had soared after playing with Conrad, that he was now bragging to his friends about being a chess player. "We owe it all to Mr. Conrad," his mother said. "We love him." Inside the library, we reported, they call him Mr. Conrad. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples of the Kansas City Public Library. Okay. 1907 annual report. At the Kansas City Public Library reading room, newspapers were placed on long desks attached to walls, requiring patrons to stand while reading. Here are men from all parts of the country who are homesick and longing for the news from the old place, the Kansas City Star reported. Touch elbows. Men scoured dailies from Chicago, San Francisco, New Orleans, Louisville, and Boston, and on occasion, you see a face light up at the name of a friend is found. "This is an American room," an attendant told the Kansas City Star. They come, No one knows whence, and they sit for a time in the reading room of the public library, noted the Kansas City Star. Tramps, they might be called, unfortunate, down and outs, perhaps. Only there's a difference. Some are young, some old, some with worldly wisdom in their faces, others representing a home guard for fast slipping into inactivity, old men mostly. Yet one thing binds them, a curiosity about life, of which they are a part, that newspapers satisfy. They come and go through the doors of the reading room, types shaken at random from the dice box of nature, seeking always food for the mind, where that for the body is lacking. And this is one of my favorites. Again, Kansas City Star, 1906. When the winter's cold came last fall, a little waif of the streets drifted into the public library and said to the keeper of the juvenile books, "I want to see a book with pictures." "Oh my, but your hands are too dirty," the woman said. She took him into the basement, washed his hands, then gave him a brownie book. That was a cereal that children read back in the early 20th century. He sat with it until the warmth of the room made him drowsy and he fell asleep. He came back every day after that and always went first to the basement and washed his hands. Then he'd go into the juvenile room and hold out his tiny hands and ask, "Are my hands clean enough for a brownie book?" He was only 4 years old, but he earned his own living by selling papers. His hair was fiery red and his face as freckled as a turkey egg. His name was Hobart. "What's your other name?" he was asked once. What other name? "One's all I got," he answered. One afternoon he came in with another waif smaller than himself. He took him to the basement and washed his hands, then introduced him to the brownie books. "What's this boy's name?" the librarian asked. "He's Bill," was the answer. Bill was a newsboy too. Every afternoon they came. One day, Mrs. Carrie Whitney, the librarian, Crosby's predecessor, took their pictures as they stood with arms around each other. I'd love to have that picture. I didn't find it, however. Notice, all these very meaningful experiences occurred in a place we call library. To categorize them as information gathering fails to capture their significance in the lives of each of these individuals. My analysis of library as place grows out of a scholarly literature often labeled public sphere, a rich repository of ideas that can deepen our understanding of the multiple reasons why people love their public libraries as community places. But now let me turn to the transformative potential of commonplace stories public libraries have circulated by the billions for generations. Meet Maria.
My birthday was yesterday and I am 95 years old. I started to use the library, I would consider 12, 13 years old, you know. Yes. I was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. We left and we started from scratch. And my English was zero, but their library was a couple of blocks away. And that's how it started. That library was everything to me. We could not afford to buy the books. Books were always expensive, and there were so many other needs. It was library, library, library all the time. And it didn't cost anything. Well, the library fills a certain place in my life. It has to satisfy certain needs. I have seen a lot of very ugly things. And you just can't live all the time with bad. You have to balance it. And my balance was mostly to see something beautiful. And so I would go to the library and spend a couple of hours. But when I come out on the street, I'm a completely different person. It gave me such a relief, as French would say, soulagement, you know.
And more anecdotes for my narrative. In a 2008 interview, 88-year-old Pete Seeger recalled an early life reading experience. At age 7, a librarian recommended me a book about a teenager who runs away from his stepfather, who's beating him and is adopted by a middle-aged Indian whose tribe was massacred and whose wife was sold into slavery and is living alone. That he remembered this story so vividly 80 years after reading it is testimony to the power of stories, and in Seeger's case, a New York Times editor noted upon his recent death, fitting for someone who went on to engage issues of conscience. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan wrote the daughter-in-law of Harold Bell Wright, whose best-selling 1920s religious novel, That Printer of Udell's, Reagan read as an adolescent in Dixon, Illinois. Wright was no favorite of contemporary literary critics. H.L. Mencken called him a liberated yokel from the cow and hog states. Another critic was equally as harsh. Harold Bell Wright supplies more negative data on the literary quality of the taste of the fiction reading public than any other author. No matter to young Reagan, however, shortly after reading the book, he declared himself saved and was baptized. The novel's protagonist, Reagan wrote Wright's daughter-in-law, 60 years later, served as a role model that shaped his life ever since. It's highly likely the copy of That Printer of Udell's Reagan read came from the Dixon Public Library, which he visited twice a week in the early 1920s, mostly to check out Frank Merriwell stories, Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan novels, and books by Horatio Alger, Zane Grey, and Mark Twain, many of which he read on the library's front steps. I'm a sucker for hero worship, he later admitted. For Oprah Winfrey, reading commonplace stories was an open door for freedom in my life and allowed me to see that there was a world beyond my grandmother's front porch in Mississippi, that everybody didn't have an outhouse, that everybody wasn't surrounded by poverty, that there was a hopeful world out there and it could belong to me. To Winfrey, the stories became her comfort, her solace, to commune with and learn something about myself, to learn something about other people, to learn something about the world. In a small Milwaukee apartment as a 9-year-old in 1963, she read a public library copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, her first all-night book, the story of Francie Nolan, whose life was full of humiliation and whose only friends were in books lining the public library shelves. I felt like my life was hers. After her father died in 1963, 9-year-old Sonia Sotomayor buried herself in reading at her Bronx library and the apartment she shared with her mother and brother. Nancy Drew had a powerful hold on my imagination, she remembered. Every night when I'd finished reading and got into bed and closed my eyes, I'd continue the story with me in Nancy's shoes until I fell asleep. Her mind, she noted, worked in ways very similar to Nancy's. I was a keen observer and listener. I picked up on clues. I figured things out logically, and I enjoyed puzzles. I loved the clear, focused feeling that came when I concentrated on solving a problem and everything else faded out. Her reading that summer, she admitted, was her solace and only distraction that got her through this time of trouble. More examples from the history of the Kansas City Public Library. In 1912, B.J.R., an immigrant who learned his English in a New York night school, complained about the lack of substantive works in the Kansas City Public Library. No Verhaeren, no Rudolf Eucken, few Nietzsche's or Bergson, he noted. Instead, mostly cheap stories. I protest against paying taxes for such institution. EOT responded in the Kansas City Star. The library should encourage fiction. The best in life comes with imagery and sentiment found in fiction. FCM was angry. What ingratitude after teaching him to read and write and putting him in the position of becoming an enlightened citizen and taxpayer. The very works of which he complained had taught English to tens of thousands for whom night school was not possible. Several years later, Kay echoed these thoughts in the Kansas City Star. Think of the poor scrub woman who has labored all day long. Shall we deny her the joy of Pollyanna and the lesson it teaches? Or think of the shop girl and the clerk shut up all day in the dingy buildings who for a breath of the woods and find it in Gene Stratton Porter's books and Edward Stanton White's. Or what about the invalid unable to grasp heavier literature? Or the businessman who wants only recreational reading after working all day? For these many reasons, I plead for a moderate supply of good, wholesome fiction in public libraries, he concluded. Its value is not always educational, but its benefits are far-reaching. All these anecdotes point to the power of printed commonplace stories to change people's lives, but stories reside in all cultural media. If you watch television, go to the movies, read popular magazines, and look at advertisements, argues Richard Keller Simon, you're exposed to many of the same kinds of stories as someone who studies the great books of Western civilization. You've simply been encouraged to look at them differently. Stories, Richard Nash argues, constitute recipes for the imagination. Media scholar Henry Jenkins adds, stories are basic to all human cultures, the primary means by which we structure, share, and make sense of our common experiences. Meet Danny.
One of the things that, say, the library offered me was that it was a place where I could actually absorb American pop culture. I grew up in an immigrant household, so I always, like, the library for me was always the place where I could get free media. When I was a teenager, I was like really big into like punk rock culture and the music scene. And I couldn't afford records, so I was always going to the library. Whereas my friends were able to either buy their records with their parents' money or worse yet, steal it. I would always go to the library and check them out. When I was a teenager, I think I might have been like 15 years old. I had heard about a film called A Beautiful Thing, which is based on a play, and it's a gay film. I remember going to the library and looking up in the catalog and like making sure like nobody saw me, and I would go, I went to the stacks, I found it, I kind of hid it underneath like a stack of books, like sandwiched between and a stack of books, and I checked it out. I took this video home, I had to hide it from my parents, and I remember watching this film, and it was so powerful to me. It was a love story between two young British teenagers, and for me, it sank. It dropped a certain anchor down where, on an emotional level, I didn't feel like I was floundering somehow. So that felt really good, and I remember playing that cassette tape, that VHS tape, over and over and over again late at night when everyone in my house was sleeping. I would sneak out to the living room and I would play this video that I had borrowed from the library like at least once a night for 3 weeks in a row, sometimes repeating certain scenes over and over again just because for me they really spoke to me. And then I would renew it.
That public libraries have always played a primary role in making stories accessible to millions of users is obvious. Ever since the Boston Public Library opened in 1854, fiction, a particular form of story, consistently averaged 66 to 75% of public library circulation. By force of demand, then, every generation of public library users has insisted on a set of stories acceptable to a majority of community members that contained messages they wanted to read, hear, and view. The latest public library circulation statistics I'll detail in a minute show they still do. History of reading scholars have clearly demonstrated the capacity of commonplace stories to stimulate reader imagination, construct community through shared meaning, and demonstrate moral achievement. In the free will act of reading, they note, readers move into and out of a text and thus appropriate meaning relevant to their own lives. Because readers can control it, the act of reading stories becomes dependably pleasurable, empowering, intellectually stimulating, and socially bonding. And it's in the act of reading stories that social and cultural acts of defiance take place. If cultural authorities lack the power to check voluntary reading for interpretations legitimized by dominant cultures, ordinary readers construct their own meanings, sometimes as groups, sometimes as individuals. Most often, public libraries do a very good job of supplying information and democratizing spaces, as is evident from Seeger's, Reagan's, and Winfrey's remarks. Sometimes they don't. In 1960, most public libraries in the South were segregated. This is a picture of two beefy white cops taking a skinny African-American teenage girl out of the Albany, Georgia Public Library in July of 1962, at which time most public libraries in the South were segregated. Black branches existed, but not in every city. And although in 1963 most American public libraries had Nancy Drew on their shelves, the New York Public Library did not. Their librarians considered series fiction trash. Instead, Sonia Sotomayor got her copies of Nancy from her mother for good behavior. The New York Public Library did not drop the ban on series fiction until 1976. Pulp paperback titles from the 50s and the 60s that many gays and lesbians read voraciously and considered survival literature were never reviewed in Booklist magazine, listed in fiction catalog, or acquired by public libraries. What public libraries often gave them instead was misinformation. Because she believed libraries are a place where we can be most anonymous and delve deeply into areas we wish to uncover in secret, one 15-year-old later recalled, it was to the library I turned in 1969 to uncover the meaning of my lesbianism, and what I found was not echoic of my own experience. Rather, those books frightened me and convinced me that this was not lesbianism I was experiencing, but something else. Remember back in the 1980s when many evangelists of information technology predicted the demise of public libraries by the turn of the century? They were wrong, dead wrong. In 2012, the latest year for which we have statistics nationally, the United States had more public libraries than ever, 17,219, including branches and bookmobiles. And that's over 3,000 more than our McDonald's in this country. Don't ask me about subways, though. While the number of visits declined slightly in 2012 from 1.52 to 1.5 billion, remember the recession forced libraries to reduce hours by 2%, more patrons were downloading library ebooks from home computers, the decade nonetheless showed a 21% increase. That same year, 93 million Americans attended a public library program, a one-year increase of 4% and an 8-year increase of 38%. 65 million attendees were children, a nearly 4% increase from the previous year and a 24% increase from the previous decade. In 2012, public libraries circulated 2.2 billion items, including audio and video materials and ebooks, a 28% increase from 2003. Circulation per capita showed a 10-year increase of 17%. Public libraries also provided users with access to 250,000 internet-ready computers, 100% more per capita than a decade earlier. For generations now, library and government officials have argued that the public library's most important role is to provide access to useful information that develops intelligent consumers, creative entrepreneurs, and informed citizens. The kind of information Thomas Edison pursued in his public library that many argue people now can retrieve on their computers at home. Public library users, however, show a different set of priorities. For them, the tens of thousands of spaces public libraries provide for many purposes and the billions of commonplace stories they circulate in a variety of textual forms are at least as important as, and for many, more important than, access to information, and for a variety of reasons. In her book, The Village Effect, How Face-to-Face Contact Can Make Us Healthier, Happier, and Smarter, Susan Pinker harnesses research in the fast-developing field of social neuroscience to demonstrate that substantial benefits accrue to those who experience high levels of face-to-face contact, including improved vocabularies, an increased ability to empathize, a deeper sense of belonging, and perhaps most important, a longer lifespan. Neuroscientific research that focuses specifically on the social nature of commonplace reading comes to similar conclusions. Fiction, notes research psychologist Keith Oatley, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up myriad interacting instances of cause and effect. Just as computer simulations can help us get to grips with complex scientific problems, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. As I pondered these conclusions from the field of social neuroscience, I wondered if the face-to-face contact American public libraries makes possible in so many ways enables users to live longer, happier, and healthier lives than non-users. That is a researchable question, and we've never undertaken it in librarianship as far as I know. And if they do, why? Answering that question requires librarianship to expand way beyond its traditional focus on information access in order to explore the community building and personal benefits of public library as place and the sociability that reading, viewing, and listening fosters. In my lifetime of research into American library history, I've read thousands of statements like, public libraries are not just warehouses of books anymore. If part of our lives accurately represents public library history, they never were. Yet, for effect and contrast, journalists often parroted and reinforced this myth by drawing on these stereotypes and on their own limited public library experiences. If I had $1 for every time I came across this kind of statement in my research, I'd probably make more than the royalties this book will generate. I've also read hundreds of sweeping predictions concerning the future of these ubiquitous institutions, of those grounded largely on a particular definition of useful knowledge in the 18th and 19th century, on best reading in the 19th and 20th century, and on information in the 20th and 21st century, of those that ignored the power of library-supplied stories millions now read, view, and listen to daily, and the library as place billions now visit annually. None prove true. I urge you all to keep that in mind as you ponder today's predictions about and plans for tomorrow's public library. Access to information, library as place, and the transformative potential of reading commonplace stories. I hope conclusions I've drawn from my historical research have persuaded you to broaden your thinking about libraries in general and public libraries in particular. The naysayers largely ignorant of this library history are still with us. It's all on the internet, hype many evangelists of information technology. Libraries are dinosaurs, grouse officials looking to cut budgets. I argue here that to combat this limited thinking, we have to extend our scope beyond information access to include, from a user's perspective, deeper analysis of library as place and the role of commonplace stories. Let me just point two examples of this. Oops, that's not right. Oh, here we go. All right, this is a picture of the lobby of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, main library, the night that a Harry Potter novel was released, 2007. I want you to see, look at the diversity that photo contains. Gender, age, race, ethnicity. And ask yourself, what's going on there? We don't really have a good idea. We've not done the research to this. Or, this is all going to make you go, aww. Okay? This is my son Andy and my grandson Teague. I wish I would have had a picture of me reading to Andy when I was that age. At any rate, Teague picked that book out of the public library, and he's fully capable of reading it, but he wanted his dad to read it to him. Now, I would ask you, does this particular dynamic, this social nature of reading that you see on public display here, is it possible that it contributes more to literacy than the forced mechanics of instruction in school, than No Child Left Behind activity, and than Common Core curriculum? Is it possible? Maybe I'm wrong. Don't you think we ought to begin investigating with longitudinal studies of something that public libraries have facilitated like this now for generations? Thank you. Okay. So by looking at these kinds of questions, my historical research demonstrates we can document hundreds, if not thousands more ways These incubators of personal happiness and informal self-education contribute to the daily lives of our patrons as individuals and as members of their community, and we can show much more clearly how they function as active and effective agents in the construction of that very community. Thank you very much. You mind if I leave that photo on for a little while yet?
Wayne, will you take some questions?
Sure, be happy to, be happy to.
Questions from the audience? Statements of support for public libraries from the audience?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me when and where the concept of a free public library first was developed or first showed
Yeah.
its head?
We have conferences of individuals who debate that question. Okay, so there really is no complete agreement, but most point to the Boston Public Library. In the middle of the 19th century, the phrase public library was applied to any library to which any member of the public had access. In order to distinguish that definition, the word free was added, and that's what happened after the Boston Public Library opened. So you'll see, pardon me? Boston Public Library opened in 1854. And it became the prototype that a lot of other cities followed. And then Carnegie hit. And was the first KCPL a Carnegie building?
No, it wasn't.
No?
We don't
Oh.
have any Carnegie buildings in Kansas City.
Whoa, you
Sedale
guys
is close.
missed out. Okay.
We built our own.
So it sounds like you're saying that this is an American concept.
Yes. Let me put it this way. The model of the model of public librarianship is what most of the rest of the world emulates when they talk about public libraries. The British were really out of the blocks first. They passed the Public Libraries Act in 1850, which I think was in part motivation for Boston to move forward. And they did establish a couple of public libraries, but they weren't the kind of come in and use all of our resources and we'll even give you popular fiction. It wasn't that way in Great Britain. It was very much prescriptive in the kind of material that was made available to individuals.
Is that because of their classes?
I would say so, yes, but there are people who would argue differently. Yes, ma'am?
Wayne, can you repeat the question when you...
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Okay. What? Yes.
And how many of all these libraries around here, how many are stuck in little tiny places?
Oh, how many libraries are stuck in little tiny places? Yeah. Of that 17,219 public libraries and their stations, 80% are in towns of 25,000 or less.
I only have 218.
Pardon me?
218
218 what?
people.
People. Oh, oh, your town is 218 people and you have a public library.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Many, many years ago.
Yeah,
Now it's
yeah.
a museum.
Yeah, okay. There are a few that beat you with populations that are less. Yes, sir.
In your view, how good a job are local library boards and employees doing at fulfilling what you feel libraries' purpose
Yeah.
is or should be?
In my view, how good are library boards doing? You realize I can be skewered for my answer in the library profession. I would be invited. Okay. It varies from place to place, okay? Now, from what I'm not saying this to be kind to Crosby. I think Crosby is a superb library director, in part because he does not come to the profession handcuffed by its traditions, necessarily. Now, having said that, let me move to the New York Public Library. Have you heard some of the controversy that occurs in the New York Public Library? The New York Public Library is fairly well controlled by a group of trustees who made the decision to pull the bookshelves that were supporting the Rose Reading Room out in order to release more space for public consumption, for public use, and move the 3 million books that are underneath the Rose Reading Room to a remote site. Brouhaha all over the place in New York City. I think the board members, and I can say this now that I've left New York from last night, I think the board members had in mind that the future of the public library was digital. And therefore, most of the resources would be ebooks, and the stuff they had, Google would take care of so we could all access from our homes. It didn't take into consideration the things that I just talked about, the power of transformative stories. Those branches, I spent 3 weeks at the New York Public Library reading branch records from the 1920s to the 1980s. And the stories that came out of those New York Public Library branch records were awe-inspiring. You could see those public libraries as places and the stories they provide. I mean, Sonia Sotomayor, hello. They transform people's lives. And to think that making everything digitized, digitizing everything, is going to be what the library needs in the future ignores what I think the past tells us. I hope that you got me going. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here, and thank you, Carlton. I see the library as a human institution for freedom, democracy, and community building, and family building. And that can be unplugged by Google or any other big internet company. The libraries are much more than books. And I think we need to emphasize that more. In Kansas City, we're very fortunate. We have a library director and a board that supports this community activity. Lots of libraries probably don't have that resource. But libraries are much more than just books.
Did you learn that from me, or did you come with that idea?
I learned it from you.
Oh, good. All right. Okay. Yeah. Now, yeah. That's the conclusion to which I came. I entitled the first chapter "So Much More Than Information," and we have not explored the depths of what this institution means to the people who use it. We haven't developed the research methodologies to unearth answers to those questions.
History gives us a couple of lessons.
It does. Yeah. Yay, history.
What did Hitler do?
Well,
Burned the books.
yes, he did.
He decimated the library.
Yes. What did Hitler do was the statement. Now, I'm going to come back at you by saying, yes, he burned books that he didn't like. At the same time, he established more public libraries per capita than were contained in the United States at the time. You know what he was using them for?
Propaganda.
Yeah, right, sure. Okay. So it's not just certain countries who are somewhat dictatorial don't want libraries. They do. Soviet Union had a lot of libraries too.
Is this part of when you're studying library science and whatever? Are they going to put this into part of library science?
When I wrote this book, I sent it to Oxford University Press deliberately because Oxford has two wings. They have an academic market and a trade market. Now, most of you don't read academic stuff. Most of what I write is academic stuff. I sent it deliberately to Oxford if the subject had traction, they'd put it in trade. Well, it has traction, and they put it in trade. But they handed me over to a senior editor who immediately said, take out all the theory. If you're going to write for a general reader, I don't want to see the word discourse in it. Okay, so it went from 240,000 words down to 135,000. I saved the theory, though. I can see you're really excited about this. I saved the theory, and it's in the latest issue of Library Quarterly. And in that issue, I say, and any institution, any ALA accredited institution that doesn't have a core course on reading and a core course on library as place is equivalent to an American Bar Association accredited law school not having a course on the Constitution and civil procedure. Now, how that'll resonate, I don't know.
Sounded pretty good.
Yeah, all right, yeah, okay. So, I mean, you got Missouri, University of Missouri's school down the road. There are a variety of other schools around, and as far as I know, there is not a single course on reading and place. What I've come to the conclusion, those are two of the most important things that public libraries do. Okay, anybody else? Yes, sir, Sean.
So you talked about the past. Does it give you any insight into like the next 20 years, the future?
By the way, we have two great library directors with us tonight. Sean Casserly has just asked this question, who's the director of the Johnson County Library, and Steve Potter, who's the director of the Mid-Continent Library, who's in the back row. And Cindy Grant of the Tonganoxie Library.
Okay, as a historian, I do not want to predict the future. All I'm going to say, Sean, is this is what the past tells me. Keep it in mind as you plan the future of your institution. If I'm right about reading and place, don't walk away from it. The last 3 years, I believe, we've seen a sort of a plateauing of ebook sales. Now, I don't know, maybe it'll shoot up again. Perhaps it will. But if we plan the future based on our expectation it will, and then it doesn't, we got egg all over our face. So that's my answer. I can't predict the future. I'm only saying this is the past as I see it. And some of that past is new to the library profession. You know, in our current literature, they're saying, oh, we're community anchors now. We've always been community anchors. We just haven't recognized it. How about one more question? If there is one? Oh, yes.
Let me stand up because I have a small voice. First of all, I think Steve Potter has some good data on the impact of public libraries. I don't know if you've talked, but
We met.
Okay, good. Also, I know a sub-story is library as social agency, and I know you've gone down this trail before. I work in an academic library. I've had the opportunity to help a homeless person re-find his family through the use of databases. First, we located his relatives, and then I was able to use Google Street Maps to actually show him where his relatives lived. So, and after years on the street, this was just it. I've had a woman come in desperate to find the story of her father who she never met, and suddenly realized that he was involved in some kind of a murder. And she wanted to use the library to research the news stories so she could reacquaint herself with this criminal father. These people come because they don't know where else to go. There's no other social agency, government agency that will help them. And this is very, I think, unrecognized role of public libraries or academic libraries, because it's happening. And I know you've looked at the whole role of social agency. Is that part of your book? This is, again, the library, the life of the user,
Yeah.
very much part of the story. Does your book look at this?
Yes, and it has anecdotes like that. The original, when you write a history, there's a stage at which you call it your mind dump stage, where you take all the data you've gathered over the years and you pour it into a narrative. That first mind dump was 500,000 words. Okay, so yes, and I had to pare it down to 135,000. I got 365,000 words I'm happy to distribute to the rest of you that talk specifically about that kind of thing. And I mean, I'm hopeful that this book will stimulate other kinds of research that do exactly what you're talking about, that go off in all different directions and show how public libraries have benefited their communities in a cajillion different ways. The evidence is there. I just simply have I wasn't allowed to have those 365 words to explain it. Then you wouldn't have read the book anyway. It would have been 3 volumes.
Wayne, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.